Hi, Janine. I am so grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you today about something that I know we're both very passionate about, which is the state of gender equality in Australia and beyond. So I think we should just get straight to the point here. So the first question that I had prepared is, one of your many amazing achievements is that you organised March for Justice, a series of women's rights protests attended by over 110,000 people globally with a single tweet. So what were the events that led up to this tweet, and why do you think people connected so much with this?
I think there are a number of events that had been occurring, not only in the months before I sent the tweet, but also in the years that I had sent the tweet. And what we'd seen in Australia in particular were a significant number of events. So if we look at those, firstly, politically, we started to see a decline in the gender pay gap in Australia. We also had in place a parliament, governing parliament, that had record numbers of women in power. And that was really playing out across a number of different fields. So you may remember the Christine Holgate, and I would call it a scandal, where our then Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, got up in Parliament and openly stated that she should resign. We saw, of course, the issues around the alleged sexual assaults in Parliament House that the then government, it would appear, had chosen to treat as a political problem rather than a sexual problem. And then on top of that, we had this growing issue of gendered violence in Australia, specifically gendered violence, domestic abuse, domestic violence in the home. And at its base, all of these issues point to one thing, and that is lack of gender equality in Australia. And so, you know, the second part of your question is, well, what happened? Why did March for Justice happen? And I think it happened because collectively women had had enough. They absolutely had enough. It wasn't just one issue, it was an entire range of issues, and it was time.
Certainly. No, I think that it very much was time. On the topic of kind of the community engagement in March for Justice, I believe that you attended the march yourself, as you kind of did set it up. On the day, what was something that really stood out to you, really just made you, took you aback, had you taken aback and go, wow, okay, this is kind of what the state of gender equality is like. This is how women are feeling.
I think the first thing that took my breath away was the sheer number of people. So when I first set out the tweet, there was a point where I made a decision that I had to back that up. I had to actually do something. There was such a visceral anger. And so I set about bringing together all of the amazing volunteers who worked to put together the events. But to be really honest, I think in the back of my mind, I kind of wouldn't have been surprised if it had been me and my four mates standing there, really. So I arrived in Canberra a few days before, and I think I was just really taken aback at the sheer volume of mostly women, but also our allies, our supporters, who came together and were really willing to stand up for this. I think the second part of your question was, on the day, what was something that I was really surprised about? I think then, having got the numbers, was then the lack of engagement from our then Liberal government.
Yeah, certainly. So, on the topic of kind of government, with everything going on in the world at the moment, especially on the topic of kind of Roe v. Wade in the US, and all of the violence against women in places like Afghanistan, what do you believe that the current Australian government and the larger Australian community can do to do their bit in changing the kind of global gender gap and the inequalities that women face?
Yeah, I think we are really in a moment of great change globally. And what we see in America is really two opposing forces colliding. So we have, with I think the leadership of the Supreme Court, the very conservative Supreme Court, working very hard to take away women's rights. And then we have in America the Democrats really working to support those rights. So the debate will be had. It'll be interesting to see what emerges from what is a real tug of war. And the world is watching. The world is very much watching, because after Roe v. Wade, of course, particularly the reproductive rights of women and the debate around that started to emerge again in Australia. And I mean, it's important to look at the differences in our social history. Australia has a very different social history than the United States. So our approach is going to be quite different. But I think that the bigger debates are going to emerge in terms of what the current government, the Albanese government, will do. I don't see a lot of movement in terms of restricting women's reproductive rights and women's rights. I think that observing particularly the number of women and the number of diverse women particularly and men in our parliament argues well for what is going to happen in Australia. But we really need to deal with the gender pay gap.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think that it's terrifying that I am a young individual who will be entering the workforce quite soon, and that I may not be, that I won't be receiving the same as my male peers. It's quite devastating.
Yeah, it is devastating. And when you look at it over a lifetime, particularly, you know, if you make a choice to have children and you leave the workforce for periods of time, you just go back further and further. And so they're really, really important issues to address. And there is real immediacy around those issues.
Yes, I 100% agree with you. So, as I've told you earlier, the audience today has quite a large teenage percentage because this is a festival at school. We've invited lots of our friends and people my age so that we can get all the young voices involved on the topic and hopefully spark some change. So, what advice would you give to us as teenagers, regardless of gender, on helping change the state of gender inequality in Australia?
As I see it, there are two things that need to happen. And the first thing is really important, and that is to speak up and speak out. So I would really define that as call it out. It's all too easy when you see things happening to think it's not your problem, it's not your issue, but it is actually really, really important to call it out. If you join an organisation and you're not getting paid as much as someone else in the organisation, you have similar skills, you need to talk about it, you need to call it out. If someone is behaving inappropriately, call it out. And that's particularly the case for men. They have to stand up to their male peers when they're behaving badly. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing, which is much more difficult to achieve, is really the structural and systemic reform. And it is something that you can do. We need women standing up for political representation. We need women standing up for our local councils, for our state and federal governments, but to stand up in our communities, to stand up to take leadership roles. So the second thing is stand up, take your position and claim it. Because until we get equal representation of women, we'll never achieve equality. So call it out and stand up and take what's yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Janine, for illuminating your story for the Dirrum Festival 2022. I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that we are so grateful to have you share your wisdom on this topic. And hopefully we can all work together to make a tangible change to gender equalities in not just Australia, but the world. So thank you so much for your time and wisdom today. And to the audience, the change starts with you, and stand up. Thank you.
Thank you.